Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming to our first 2022 SIPS and Civility event. It's so great to see everyone's faces, at least, your eyes. Thank you for keeping your mask on tonight so we can all try to keep each other safe. I know Kim Knox, our president, would love to share a few words, so Kim?
Hi everyone, I'm Kim Knox, president of the League of Women Voters of San Diego. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight and for getting vaccinated or tested. I wanted to let you know also that we are an all-volunteer organization and we appreciate any donations that you might have made when you registered for this event, or if after attending the event you'd like to donate, you can always do that through our website, lwvsandiego.org. By the way, our next event is coming up on Wednesday the 26th. It'll be on Zoom at 2 p.m. and the topic is the Supreme Court. So we hope that you can join us for that as well. Back to Janelle.
Thank you, Kim. That was great. So tonight we have two speakers that are going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A. We have index cards at all of the tables, so if you do have questions, please write them down and kind of hold it in the air, and Jane will come around and pick that up for you, and then we'll try to get those answered tonight. We will also do group discussions after the speakers and the Q&A sessions. So it looks like we're actually spread out pretty nicely. We want to keep the tables to about 4 people, and then there'll be a group discussion leader that'll go through some questions that we can all talk about together as a group. And we'll do a second session where we'll mix up the group a little bit and then do that again. And then at the end, we'll kind of talk about what everybody shared and see if we have any action items that we can take home with us after tonight. With that, I want to introduce our speakers. So our first speaker is Jeannie Widener. She is the chair of the voter empowerment for the League of Women Voters of San Diego. She has been the chair of our Speakers Bureau since 2020 and has been one of our strong public speakers about voting issues and ballot questions. She recently gave a talk to the Fulbright Foundation. This is Jeannie Widener. And I'll let you speak now, and I'll introduce Ray.
Well, I would like to welcome everybody tonight, too, to our first SIPS and Civility in over 2 years. So, as you all know, a lot of things have happened in that time. So, we're glad that you can be here tonight. I'm glad we can be in person, even though we all have to try to hide our identity. So again, my name's Jean Widener. I'm chair of the Voter Empowerment Committee. And I'd like to start off this evening with some background information on election integrity, since that seems to be on many people's minds since the election of November 2020. There have been a lot of questions about whether our elections are secure. So I'd like to start with who oversees our elections. And as you can see from this section of the Constitution, elections were placed under the oversight of the states primarily, but a provision does allow Congress, who may at any time by law make or alter such regulations. So that provision has allowed for the 3 amendments that we have made to our Constitution, as well as authorize the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that I'll be referring to again before the end of my talk. So in the interest of our time this evening, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about how secure our elections are, but I have placed a pamphlet on all of the tables that is offered through the Election Assistance Commission for the United States. And in it, it outlines several of the steps that makes our elections secure, the election safeguards that are available for our state as well as for many other states. And that includes that voter registration rolls are updated constantly. There is no internet connection for our voting machines so that they can't be hacked by a bad actor. That all of our election workers usually work in tandem, and how mail ballots are guarded, and how the signatures on them are verified and matched before the ballots are counted. So what I'd like to, probably the area that had the greatest controversy in the last election was vote by mail. And that, even though that method has actually been in effect in our country since the Civil War, because it was first used to make sure that the soldiers on the battlegrounds actually were able to cast their vote in the 1864 election. So I just want to ask, do a little poll and find out how many of you voted by mail during the 2020 election. So, as you can see, it's a very popular method. It actually was the reason that led to the high turnout that we had that year. And I think it really had gone a long way toward making people feel that they can be a part of their democracy. In fact, California, as you know, just recently joined the other 7 states as an all mail-in ballot state. So that was just this year. So there are a few myths that are around this, and I'm not going to take the time to discredit each of them, but I'm going to mention a few of them. Vote by mail ballots are likely to be forged, illegally printed, fraudulently signed. They will be sent to non-residents of California, including undocumented immigrants. And that vote by mail actually favors one party over the other. The league has done a great job of dispelling all of those myths at a website called Voting Safe at Home that gives the facts about these and a couple of other myths. So that on the back of the handout that's at your table on how I can help, there are dozens of links to some of the things that I am referring to, or where I've got a lot of my information tonight. So if you want to if you'd like more information about that, I welcome you to refer to that. But what I mostly want to do in terms of this issue of voter fraud is look at the data that we have about it. And the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative organization, keeps a database of all voter fraud cases in the United States. And you can see that their concern about it let me go back to that. You can see their concern about it in May of 2020, when they referred to the database having swelled to 1,200 proven cases, 1,285 proven cases of voter fraud in America. I checked this week, and that has now gotten up to 1,340 cases and has resulted in 1,152 convictions. What they don't say is that this database contains data for 25 years worth of voting. So the fact that it only went from 1,285 to 1,340 since May of 2020 means that they've only found another 55 proven cases of voter fraud in the last year and a half. And they also break it down by that they found 239 cases of fraudulent use of absentee ballots. And that data is through 2019. So since they're putting this information out to the public, which is very interesting, I'd like to put it into perspective for us this evening, though. So that amounts to about 55 cases of voter fraud per year nationally, about 11 cases of mail ballot fraud per year nationally based on up till 2019. But the fact that we have 120 million people average vote in our presidential elections in the last 20 years makes those numbers extremely insignificant. And in fact, it comes out to 0.05% of total votes cast. Now, they'll argue that these are only proven cases of voter fraud and that there may be many others that they are not finding. But I would argue with a number that low, it would take an enormous amount of conspiracy to hide any kind of voter fraud that's going on in our country. So so what are the election security risks that we really do have now, given that our election system is working and has been working for decades, if not centuries? And the American Security Project is a nonprofit think tank that's focused on national security, foreign policy, and climate change issues, actually. It's a bipartisan organization with both Republican and Democratic people on their board. And this is their quote about one of the things that they feel is threatening to our democracy or our election security. And that is that disinformation is exacerbating partisan divides, eroding public faith, and threatening the core of American democracy. And as you know, disinformation isn't really anything new, but in the past decade or so, because of social media and all of the avenues that we have to get our information, it has been very easy to spread it faster and to magnify it in the last couple of decades. One of the other things that I feel is a threat to our election security are some of the voter suppression laws that are now being proposed and enacted that actually make it harder for people to vote. And right now we have 19 states that have enacted 33 laws that restrict voting. Probably the most important, though, of those new laws that could be a threat to our democracy are these partisan sabotage laws where state legislators have introduced at least 10 bills in 7 states that would directly empower partisan officials to change or overturn election results after the votes have been cast, or to penalize or criminalize election workers who are actually on the ground accepting these votes. So this is probably one of the areas, and in my last segment here, I'll show why that really can be a problem. So the other thing that I think is a threat to our democracy is actually enshrined in our Constitution, and that is the Electoral College. And I don't know if any of you have heard some league members talk about the Electoral College. We had a presentation on it last year, and I know Jeannie Brown has given several presentations on it. But the league has supported abolishing the Electoral College since 1970. Which is, interestingly, the same year that Congress wanted to abolish the Electoral College. It passed the House of Representatives on a bipartisan basis, but when it was sent to the Senate, guess what it encountered? The filibuster. And as a result, that it was not passed, and that may have actually been our last opportunity to get a bipartisan agreement of the dangers of the Electoral College. As a result, the League has supported the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact since 2010, and I'm not going to go into the details of that, but it essentially means that if we can get enough states to agree to give their electors to the popular vote winner, the Electoral College will become moot. So, and again, I have a link for you to check on that if you'd like to know more. But the last thing I want to talk about here in terms of threats to our elections are that the concern over voter fraud in 2020 would be absolutely moot if it weren't for the Electoral College. For one thing, if we didn't have to count the electors on January 6th, we wouldn't have had anybody attempt to interfere with that counting. So if the Electoral College did not exist, we wouldn't be having the problem that we had in January of last year. And I'd also like to show how the Electoral College could have been another problem in the 2020 election. As you can see from these popular vote totals, as you know, key battlegrounds are those states that have a close enough margin of error in terms of who they're voting for, Republican or Democrat, that make them battlegrounds. And this is where all of the campaigns are focused, because they want to win these states that they feel can be winnable. And as you can see, President Biden won the popular vote by about 4.5%. Former President Trump won the battleground states by about 2%. And President Biden actually won the remaining states by almost 9%. Another interesting factor about the non-battlegrounds is that the third-party candidates actually did about 50% better in the non-battleground states than they did in the battleground states, which is another indication that the Electoral College actually suppresses third-party candidates as well, because people feel that they are throwing away their votes since they know with the winner-take-all that they would not have an influence on who wins their state. The other aspect of this in the electoral vote of 2020, Mr. Biden won significantly by 306 to 232 electoral votes. But you may not know that if vote margins were slightly different in 3 key states, that we would have had the same situation that we had in 2000 and in 2016, where the winner of the popular vote would have been denied the presidency. And the reason is because if there were different in these 3 states, Arizona, Georgia, or Wisconsin, or all 3 of them together, if those 3 states had actually gone the opposite way, the electoral vote would have been tied at 269. It would have thrown it into the House of Representatives. And in this case, each state gets 1 vote. And since we have more Republican-leaning states than we have Democratic-leaning states, Mr. Trump would have been granted the presidency by the House of Representatives, in spite of having lost the popular vote. So we came within 43,000 votes of having that happen again. And with those partisan sabotage laws that are being enacted in some Republican states, the likelihood that that could have happened is actually much greater now. It would be very easy for them to just dismiss 0.3% of their votes and throw them out. So what are we doing about it? Well, right now there are two laws that are before the Senate, and actually, to bring you absolutely up to date on this, just this morning, the House passed a version of combining these 2 laws on voting, these 2 voting laws, the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. To combine them into 1 bill, they sent it to the Senate, and this is what the Senate will be deliberating on and hopefully voting on next week. Senator Schumer is planning to bring that before the Senate. You've all probably heard that it still faces the possibility that the filibuster will kill it if they cannot get, obviously they're not going to get 60 senators to vote for it, but they're hoping to make changes to the filibuster, but they may not even get all of the Democrats to agree to that. So these 2 new laws are the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis Voting Act. They have many provisions in it that will help with the problems that I mentioned, as well as making voting more accessible to our citizens. And then finally, another bill that is being considered by Congress is to reform the Electoral Act count of 1887. And this is what was in place during January 6th. This is the rules or so ever what they followed in terms of counting electors. Every time I start reading anything about this, they talk about how confusing it is, how ambiguous it is, and how poorly written it always was. So it obviously needs some reform. So right now, it only takes a single member from each chamber to object to a slate of electors. It takes just a simple majority in each chamber to actually throw out those electors. And the role of the vice president is very ambiguous. It's not clearly identified. But this bill that's before Congress, or not, it hasn't been completely worked out yet. But they are considering reforming this act. And one of the things that they're considering reforming is to require more of each chamber, possibly up to a third, to initiate an objection, require a supermajority to negate a counting of any of those electors. It clarifies the vice president's role to unequivocally remove any power to reject any results. And then finally, it provides a judicial review process if a state government fails to follow its own lawful procedures in bringing forth electors. So this is where we are now in terms of trying to preserve and advance our democracy at the federal level. And I welcome any questions now, or if we want to have our discussion, it'd be fine too.
Jane, that was awesome. This is part of the reason I love being a member of the league. We could just give her a round of applause. Education is a huge part of being a league member, so I am grateful for everyone that comes out and researches things and does speaking for all of us, so that's really awesome. So we have one more speaker. Ray Lopez Calderon is now a strategic advisor with More Equitable Democracy, a racial justice organization working to advance racial equity through electoral reform. Ray grew up in LA and worked in Chicago for about 20 years as a community organizer. He became executive director of Common Cause in Illinois and later the director of Common Cause California. He recently worked for the Allegiance San Diego, and welcome, Ray.
It's actually Alliance San Diego, just to correct that. But thank you so much. And also, I am definitely a native Californian. I was born in the LA area, lived there for quite a bit, and then also lived in Orange County, and now I'm in San Diego, so I feel like very, very Southern California. And I forgot when I was a kid, we lived in the Bay Area, so I'm very Californian. However, I did live for 20 years in the Midwest, which has created sort of a really fun dynamic in my head, is that because I've lived in different places and I've worked all over the country, I kind of view all of these problems from both the local and the national perspective, right? I get to see communities, on the micro level, and I've been able to mess with the electoral system on the national level in terms of lawsuits and being part of programs and lobbying efforts. And so I love our democracy, and I love the sort of richness that you see across the country. The diversity, the varieties, but I also have some issues with our democracy and our country. So I wanted to just thank you for that great presentation on a good chunk of the system, particularly voter integrity. I think that's, like you said, it's on the tip of everyone's tongues today. I'm going to be a little bit more broad on what I want to talk about because I feel like there's so much that isn't talked about that I want to kind of like expose you to a couple things and then also kind of make a case for what I think people should be talking about a lot more, if that's okay with you. So first off, I am going into my, gosh, my 50th year almost and on this planet. And I grew up in a weird family. My father's family is multi-generations of gangs from LA. My mother's family is indigenous and Sephardic, descendants of Sephardic Jews from the Southwest. So I have this perspective of diversity, but I have also a perspective of many different groups who've never really been at the table or have been at the table and have been pushed out of the table, off the table. And so I've always viewed how we look at democracy from that perspective. And that's kind of what I'm doing right now with more equitable democracy. We're looking not just at electoral reforms that make voter suppression less awful, or we try to block it, or we try to build voter access, like do things like automatic voter registration, things like that will make it easier to vote, but also looking a little bit deeper at the fundamental problems we've had over centuries now of the country, right? So my take is that this country was built foundationally on a structure, particularly the National Congress, right? On a structure that empowered a very small group of people in the country. In fact, the founders really wouldn't have even been able to create this country, a federal union, in the way that they did had they not compromised with some of the interests that they had at the table, particularly slave owners in the South, but other interests as well, like very wealthy interests. And so the compromise that they came up with, it can explain a lot of different problems we're having right now. One of those is the Electoral College, but it's also other things like money in politics, right? How the system has been structured has changed, but it hasn't changed, right? We've seen iterations, we've seen different sort of reform movements over the years. I worked with Common Cause for nearly a decade. We were some of the pioneers with the League of Women Voters, in trying to change the electoral system. The last time that I was at Common Cause was just a few years ago, and we mounted a major Supreme Court case to challenge partisan gerrymandering. Most of you probably already know, but that it's basically the ability of legislators to pick their own voters rather than voters picking them. And the Supreme Court just said, well, that could be kind of bad, but that's really the state's problem to deal with it, and they kind of turned a blind eye to it. So, you could spend millions of dollars literally to wage these campaigns, and you have parts of the government who are just like, nah, we don't want to deal with that. And so after a while, you start thinking, we're working on so many different, angles to fix the system. One is voter access. I led a campaign in Illinois with a team that got the first automatic voter registration and same-day registration in Illinois in its history. We were super excited, and it was very successful, but you still had an entrenched money in politics in the process, particularly from the Democratic Party in Illinois. And so, you plug one hole in the dam, and then the water comes out over here. They're like, oh shoot, now we got to deal with this problem, right? I mentioned money in politics because that's one that really affects everybody fairly equally. It just depends on what region you're in. In San Diego, up until recently, a lot of the money in politics issues were around the Republicans, right, thwarting or running random initiatives to try to kill certain things and just keeping everybody on their toes by funneling money into the process, right? But in other places, it's the Democrats. It's like, it just depends if you have to look at all of the picture. Then that's usually on the local level, right? So a particular state, a particular city. But money is always at the root of this, right? Before it was, campaign contributions, it was bribery, right? I had a debate with a professor from UNAM, which is the National Autonomous University of Mexico, the prestigious university in Mexico City. And I had the audacity it was on a radio show, I had the audacity to say that we were just as corrupt as Mexico. And she laughed at me, like, you've got to be kidding me. And she started talking about, how the narco government and how the drug cartels just, buy off anybody, and anybody that they don't like, they kill, right? And I said, I get that 100%. My husband's from Mexico. I live part of the time in Mexico. Now, I'm not like oblivious to the actual reality of Mexico. In fact, my husband's from the town where they killed 44 students and disappeared them just a few years ago. I understand that. However, what you don't understand is that many years ago, let's say 100 years ago in Chicago, we had the exact same situation. You had the gangsters buying off judges, buying off cops, and killing people who didn't agree with them. And guess what we did in the United States? We legalized bribery. We absolutely legalized bribery. We call it campaign contributions now, right? But we legalized bribery. So I told her, I said, the difference what we have in the States is that at least in Mexico, you can see this is shady corruption and there's bags of cash being exchanged and it's evil. You might not feel like you can do anything about it, but at least you know it's happening. And here it's like, oh, we don't have that problem. Nobody thinks we have that problem. I said, that's worse because you can't actually diagnose an illness if your symptoms are being masked. So for me, that's one of the fundamental things I challenge people to really think about, not just, on the national level with the Congress and how the Republican and Democrat sort of dynamic has been playing out over the years, but locally, right? You now have a largely democratically controlled region, very new for San Diego, right? So everyone's super excited because we have a whole new different group of people. But just this last year, the San Diego City Council tried to overturn an election result on Measure C that actually had been declared as having lost because they felt it was in their interest because of their own campaign contributors. And so they had the audacity to actually do that, and no one kind of blinked an eye because, well, it's particularly the liberals, I'll say that because I am at least a liberal. I'm very nonpartisan, but I'm a liberal. It's our guys, right? So we're just kind of, we're not going to say anything. I wrote an op-ed that we never sent out when I was at Alliance San Diego, and it was just a long story why. But, I likened the entire process that they went through to Orwell's Animal Farm. You literally could see like the pigs at the table deciding to change the words, like literally saying, oh, it passed because there's some case in Oakland that said, you should only have a majority vote for a measure. And people just weren't looking at it, just like, oh, okay, whatever. As someone who lived in Chicago for 20 years under complete democratic rule, I'm saying all this to you because I want you to not allow San Diego to become Chicago. It is so easy to happen. I've seen it because of the partisan mentality we have in this country. When you're under fire from the Republicans, right, in certain ways, it's easy to say, well, these are our guys, I guess we have to protect. But you have to remember the people you're protecting aren't Democratic operatives, Democratic elected officials, or Republican operatives or Republican officials. You're trying to protect people who are outside of this building right now who don't have a place to live, right? You're trying to protect people who don't have access to health care. You're trying to protect people who don't have access to education. So the partisanship is part of it, but the money in politics seeps into it. And then you have a problem because everyone starts thinking, well, what's the point, right? I swear I was on the elevator coming into the event tonight, and there was a woman, I struck up a conversation with her for a second as she was getting into the library itself. And she asked what was going on up there, and I said, it's a talk on politics and democracy is what I told her. And she said, oh, I'm not really into that. And I said, well, part of the talk's gonna be, why aren't people into that, right? And she said, she said, quote unquote, here's how I see it. As long as the rich are rich and the poor are poor, it's not gonna change. Problem with that is that until you change the structures and the rules, until we actually do fundamental changes, she's right? I've spent decades with voter engagement, voter registration, turning out people, organizing churches and synagogues, and like just you name it, bringing out. And every time I promise them it's going to change, right? If we get you out to vote, you got to vote, right? You got to be part of the process. But there's always some fundamental stumbling block. So let me give you one more example. I know I'm talking a long time. I recently I recently found out that my husband is going to be barred from the country for life. We have been waiting for 10 years. We thought he had a 10-year exclusion for immigration. Turns out he's barred for life because there was a law that changed in 1996, and he was only tried to cross one time, right, before he finally came in a second time. But the first time that he actually got caught trying to come in, they put on this record that he said he was an American citizen, which is not true, but that's what's in the police report, as it were. That law changed 3 months before he had been stopped at the border. If he had been stopped at the border 3 months before, he wouldn't have been a problem because the family integrity that was built into the immigration laws was still there. They weren't separating all of these families and children and all this stuff like they do now in a crazy way. That law was signed by Bill Clinton, and it was the Newt Gingrich Congress. It was the Contract America, for anybody who's old enough to remember that. That law went into effect, and since then, the entire community of people who are either immigrants or in an immigrant situation like I am have been in a utter fear of our lives, of protecting our lives, of protecting our loved ones. And we've gone through multiple iterations of Congress, multiple presidents. The last time we actually had a real chance to change it was in 2006, but it got killed for two reasons. One was it was going to be very hard to get the one swing person they needed to overcome the 60-person filibuster, which you just heard about. But they probably could have got it because they were working on it, and even President Bush was going to sign it because he's one of those random things where he was really good on, which was immigration. But the moneyed special interests within the Democratic Party killed it because they were worried that there was too much flexibility with the guest worker program, which would allow people to come in temporarily as workers, and they thought it would create a problem for union workers. This is before the Democrats, the union members rebranded as like super pro-immigrant. That was our last chance. The filibuster, the money in politics, all of these things are kind of converging, right? They're converging in a way. On top of that, so I'm gonna give you some hope, I promise. On top of that, we have, I think a lot of our community, and I say that by my community right now, I'm talking about the people who are in electoral reform. A lot of our community is really trying to lock on to things to kind of ease the pain, to stop the bleeding. Some of those things are things like redistricting. You can redistrict all day, right? You can try to make it a little bit better. You can try to, stop them from manipulating the thing. But then at the end of the day, redistricting is a remedy that's built on segregation, right? For many, generations, people fought some of the evils that were inherent in segregation. And then the only remedy we actually were able to get out of the courts was a remedy that creates segregated majority-minority districts. That's the way it is, and it has helped us get some representation, even though it hasn't increased a lot, because something like 22%, I believe, of Congress is diverse compared to 40% of the America that is not white. So it's not like it's been a huge remedy, but it's at least had us, a little bit further away from zero. The redistricting parts, it's kind of, you're fixing something as much as you can, right? But you're still based on a system that is majority run. The Electoral College is structured for majority, and then you also have a system that almost every other country in the world, except for a handful of former English colonies, use a winner-takes-all system, right? So no matter what you do, you're still going to get districts, right, where you're just going to get one person, and if you're in the minority, too bad. Are people familiar with proportional representation? We are? Okay. So, funny thing, in the United States, it was a very big deal, right? Lots of states had it. Illinois, for example, used to have cumulative voting, which is a type of proportional voting. You have, instead of one person who wins most votes, like a plurality, you'll get multiple members in a district, so that if you have a significant chunk of people, they'll at least get some representation. They just don't get overrun by the first past the post, is what a lot of people call it. This is the thing I've been thinking about lately. Because there are, again, a lot of these things that we do, we have to do them so that the system as it is doesn't crush us. But then there's the thing we have to do that's going to help people the next 20, 30, 40 years. And it's one of the, I feel like even some of the groups that I've worked with who are big names in the business of election reform don't think 20, 30, 40 years out enough, right? If we would have thought about these things 20, 30, 40 years ago when ALEC and the religious right was building an empire and a strategy to make the system even more difficult, we probably would be in a different place. But we've got to think bigger now. Recently, I was reading some works that Lani Guinier had put out. She was a professor at Harvard Law, recently passed away. One of the most intelligent, amazing people I've ever had a chance to meet, but also just in general, she's an amazing person. She had a little bit of fame outside of the academic world when Clinton was trying to nominate her for the Supreme Court, and then people immediately painted her as this deranged, crazy woman with strange hair, literally, that's how they painted her. But if you actually go back and read some of her stuff, it's mind-blowing how prescient she is about what's happening right now in America, and how the systems and how the folks that are doing these anti-voter laws, they're planning all these things because they know how the populace behaves, and they know how to sort of tweak at the margins to make it difficult for people to get representatives of their choice. Lonnie talked about a couple of things, but one of the things she said in 1995 is that it's not good enough to just try to get a person of color elected in a particular new office, because that when you do that, you're going to get those folks to be super excited. She specifically said, if you ever get a black candidate in a new role that's never been, you're going to get a tremendous output of black interest in elections, because it's new, it's different. And she said, as soon as that person's an incumbent, it's going to start waning, right? It's going to start waning because then people are faced with the reality of the system, right? That whoever they elected couldn't change all those awful things that we're dealing with, and so now it's less energy. She said that in 1995. She didn't know Barack was going to get elected, right? But it's that's exactly the energy, and you see how everyone kind of goes, oh my gosh, this is going to change America, right? People were talking about post-racial America and all this garbage, and it's Lani Guinier in 95 is yeah, that's never going to happen. Here, let's talk about the system, really. And so this is what's important. Proportional are we out of time? Okay. Proportional representation would allow large blocks of people that would normally lose in a first past the post election to get representation. It's very similar to what you would see in Europe or Israel or Canada, where you have multiple parties getting seats. And I think that's where I would like to leave it, because I think that is something that the United States had a history of. There was a concerted effort by the two major parties to kill proportional representation, but it's probably our only, I think, hope to really fundamentally change the system and sort of gear ourselves away from just all of the stuff that we're doing to plug the holes in the dam. If I had more time, I would talk a lot about proportional representation, but I wanted to leave it on that thing. Thank you very much.
Ray, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Again, I love all the education we're receiving tonight. We are running a little bit behind schedule, so I think we're going to have to cut the Q&A and then go into our discussion groups. So I think we are all pretty spread out. With the discussion leaders, raise your hand just so I can see where you are. So we need someone at this.
Take your mask off. I think so. Very vaccinated. At our table, we talked about proportional representation, and we were just talking about
ranked choice voting. We just had a really good conversation. We tried to answer that question around what would be our dream around like voter rights. Or not voter rights. What was the question? Sorry. What do we want a fair election to look like? And it just, we started off with a very huge like, we can't do this. But then eventually we came out like, we definitely want to abolish the Electoral College, want to make it a holiday, and just want to get the information out in a fair and just way so it makes it easier and less complicated for people to learn about the election. So we had a good conversation. We were just talking about ranked choice in New York City. So thank you.
Great, beautiful. Okay. Sheila.
Okay, I'm going to build on the question she answered, because one of the things that came up, and we've got some educators at our table, was to kind of the utopian, I call it the rainbows and unicorns scenario, but it was more civics education. Don't just, it's not half a semester, 11th and 12th grade. Like weave it in through, you know, I wrote down K through 12. Like at the beginning, as appropriate for kindergartners, what does this look like? So that when you get an educated electorate.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me okay? We had an interesting international perspective at our table right now. So Anna is from Brazil and was sharing kind of her perspective. And I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Anna, but you said, well, looking at your electoral college is just shocking to me. then that's scary that you would go ahead and do it that way, where Brazil has more of a popular vote approach, as well as it is a day off and everyone can take that day to vote. And something interesting that we also learned is that voting is mandatory in Brazil, so we haven't made that decision here. But regardless of all that, of all the differences, she still said, well, it still doesn't work perfectly, right? And whatever your system is, you're bound to have some challenges. Within our table, though, speaking of kind of our utopia, what would a fair election system look like with integrity? I think all of us were in consensus of, it is a no-brainer to get rid of the Electoral College, but really going back to getting money out of politics and fixing the system. So that more people can participate and their voices heard. And we also brought up the perspective of, people do get discouraged when they're, you vote and you don't know what that goes toward or if it even makes a difference. And if we can begin to see that might start to change the tide. So there is some hope there.
Hi, Julie. Our table spoke to a lot of the things you guys already mentioned. Ranked choice voting, definitely we were talking about that. I think a general theme is get money out of politics, get money out of elections, campaign finance reform, and part of that is how do you get the Trojan horses who are going to dismantle the system that got them elected, and how do you convince people who were elected with the old system to change what got them in the first place. So figuring out, we did a lot of scheming of how that might work. We also talked about democracy dollars, which I think we're going to hear more about, but this has been happening in Seattle and talking about trying to bring it to San Diego, and just the idea of any kind of novel election system, the idea of trying to bring it in on a local level as a pilot program and prove that it can work, prove that it can bring a third-party candidates or these dark horse candidates who are not as influenced by big money, get them elected and make people feel like their vote is actually counted and they're not just getting absorbed by the big party. So we're very curious to just keep watching how that's working in cities trying it and maybe trying to get it to work here. But yeah, we're up against big money that doesn't want to change the system. So kind of, I don't know, I think we got to throw a lot of darts at the wall and see what sticks. But yeah, that's sort of what I was picking up from my table. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming.